and welcome, John, or welcome back. I'm very excited to have Dr. John Hare give the seminar today because he graduated with his PhD from an extremely elite institution, our very own SoMAS. And I think he's really had a productive and meaningful career. Very productive scientist. He is now the Science and Research Director of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. He does work in a lot of different areas. He's going to talk about his contribution, some of his contributions to the impacts of climate change on fisheries. And just to give a little history of John's background, he left SoMAS in 1994 and went to Beaufort. And the Beaufort position turned into a permanent position with NOAA as a research fish biologist. And actually, I think that's when I was first introduced to John, because I was there 2 summers. And I remember that well. Actually, I remember a night during the summer, a horrible thunderstorm that took out all the power at about 11 o'clock at night. And apparently, I don't know if you remember this, John, but there was 2 of us there because we both came wandering out in the dark and kind of ran into each other in the parking lot. So I'm both putting in long hours at that time. But then John went on to become the supervisor and marine scientist at NOAA Fisheries Service in Narragansett. And then eventually has now become the Science and Research Director of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And his research, in addition to climate change, addresses fisheries oceanography more generally and other issues within fisheries. But it's just a pleasure to have John here presenting to the department as an example of someone who got a degree from our program and has, I think, really had a successful career. And I encourage people to look at his publications in addition to what he's going to talk about today. So with that, John, I'd like to turn it over to you and I guess officially welcome you back to SoMAS.
Thank you very much. I was supposed to really be back last year, but that obviously was interrupted. So I'm happy to have the opportunity to speak to all of you remotely. Mike has sort of just run through my sort of steps through my career, so I won't go into that anymore. If I remember correctly, though, when I was at Stony Brook, it was called MSRC, not SoMAS, and so I think that's right, but it was a long time ago. So today I'm going to talk about climate change and fisheries, and sort of there's 5 topics. One, I just want to give an introduction to NOAA Fisheries. Some of you may be familiar, some of you may not. Just an introduction, and then climate fisheries are changing climate in the Northeast. How fish populations are responding to that changing climate. How human populations are changing fish populations. And just talk a little bit about sort of the challenges and opportunities from a NOAA science perspective of how do we do our job in a changing environment. So a little bit about NOAA fisheries mission. NOAA is government agencies. I'm a bureaucrat now, which is good to know. And our mission is science to support stewardship of the nation's ocean resources. And for me, the word stewardship really resonated with me. So stewardship is really sustainability, conservation, protection. Science is sustainability, conservation, protection of the nation's ocean resources. Our role, our job falls into a couple of different categories. We have fisheries, and that's where the sustainability mission comes in. It's the sustainable fisheries, aquaculture, We then have protected species, whale, seal, turtle, salmon, sturgeon, coral. That's where the conservation and protection comes in. And we have habitats and ecosystems, all 3 conservation and protection come in. So what we do is quite expansive, and as working on the science side of NOAA, our job is to provide science in support of this mission. And I'm going to so Northeast Fisheries Science Center, NOAA Fisheries is broken up into work at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, which is the Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, which is the the Northeast U.S. continental shelf ecosystem. We work from the top of watersheds out into the ocean. We have facilities Maine, and we look for the species that we're dealing with. Species there along the bottom. Protected species there along the bottom. Turtles, whales, and dolphins, and some fish, protected fish. We have aquaculture that we work on, and then we also do a lot of work in sort of ecosystems and habitats, again, from water. For the nation, and so the $100 recreational fishing trips a year in the region. There's more than 175 fishing communities have been identified from Maine to North Carolina. So I think I've talked about this one a couple times. So temperature is increasing. But the important thing is we know it's more than just temperature. It's ocean acidification, sea level rise, changes in circulation, salinity, and dissolved oxygen. When we look forward, we can use climate models to look forward. And this is the result of a high resolution climate model that's been produced at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. And it shows the anticipated or projected increases in temperature in 80 years under a doubling of atmospheric CO2 scenario. And so that red that you see up here, this is in the Gulf of Maine. This is bottom water in the Gulf of Maine. That the bottom waters in the Gulf of Maine are projected to warm 4 or 5 degrees from the present day. The sort of shelf waters south of Long Island in this area are projected to warm 2 or 3 degrees in the 80-year projection. This is a rapidly warming ecosystem. And so if we come back and look at, this is a temperature trend for 150 years in the Northeast US shelf. You see this long-term trend, that's the climate trend. You see this multi-decadal variability, that's the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation or Atlantic multi-decadal variability. And then if you think of a 2 to 3 or 4 degree increase above this long-term trend, in this slide, you're up in this region. So you're between 12 and 14 degrees in the past. So you take it 13 degrees, you add 2, you're up here, 15 degrees is a minimum. So we're up in this area here. And so within the next 80 years, we're expected that the Northeast US shelf will be in conditions which haven't been experienced in at least the past 150 years, likely much longer than that. And temperature is but one piece of this. It's also circulation, salinity, ocean acidification, dissolved oxygen, and more. So the climate change signal in this ecosystem is large. So when we think about what is this doing to fish populations, it's useful to think what are the responses possible for a population to a changing climate. One option is this population just stays put. A second option is that a population moves and tracks sort of the warming or changes in dissolved oxygen, tracks the environment. And the third option is biological adaptation. And these are not mutually exclusive, but it is useful to think about responses in these 3 buckets. I'm going to go through an example of each. So this is a sort of fish staying in place. And so the changes that can happen to a population is there can be changes in growth rate, changes in productivity, changes in recruitment, maturity, mortality. This is an example from some work by Rich Bell It shows the productivity of the winter flounder population. You can think of productivity as the number of young produced per parent. And so that productivity has been decreasing over the 30 years of this study, and that is correlated to increasing temperature. But there are other examples in addition to winter flounder. There's similar studies and examples for yellowtail flounder, Atlantic croaker, Atlantic cod. So there are, the staying in place has population level consequences. The other, sort of response is moving. We know many species are shifting northwards. The map on the lower left shows it's a curvilinear line. So we've taken the distance from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, and then looked at where the center of a population is. So the top graph is the center of the population of black sea bass. So in the 1970s, it was around 250, which is down here. And then in the 2010s, it's up around 400 and 450. So the center of the black sea bass population has shifted northwards approximately 200 kilometers. Similarly with scup, in the 1970s, they were down here at between 200 and 300, the center of the population. And then in the recent years, they're up more around 400 and 500. So those population has shifted north, the center of it by about 200 kilometers. This is a study by Kristen Kleisner, and it's a rose diagram. So think of it as a compass, and each line is the direction and magnitude of movement of a different species. And so, movement to the northeast is sort of all of these species have been moving to the northeast over that same time series, 1970s to the 2010s. But there are a handful of species that have shifted to the southwest. And so this is, just illustrative that the response to a changing environment is not the same across all species. There are species-specific differences. In terms of thinking about adaptation, this is one of the least studied elements of how populations respond to climate change. There are more and more studies, but generally just much harder to do and much less information. The example here is for winter skate in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This map shows temperature. And so you can see the southern part of the Gulf of St. Lawrence is very warm. And if you out here on the Scotian Shelf, it's much cooler. And these two populations of winter skate, the one from southern Gulf of St. Lawrence and the other from Scotian Shelf, have very different sort of life history traits. So the maximum age in the Scotian Shelf is 21 years. In the Gulf of St. Lawrence, it's 11 years. The age at maturity is 8 to 9 years on the Scotian Shelf. It's 5 to 6 years on the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The mean egg case length is 80 sort of millimeters. Gulf of St. Lawrence, it's 64 millimeters. And these life history differences have been sort of traced back to epigenetic changes in gene expression between the Gulf of St. Lawrence population and the Scotian Shelf population. So it's an example of epigenetic adaptation to these differing environments. And so when we think about looking forward with climate change, this is some species distribution modeling, which was done in a subsequent paper by Kristen Kleisner. It shows a statistical species distribution for Atlantic cod, looking back in the past, on the left, 1968 to 1990, and then projecting forward 80 years with that high resolution model that I showed you before. And then Atlantic croaker on the bottom, 1968 to 1990 on the far left, and then 80 years forward on the far right. And you see that the model projections indicate that Atlantic cod could be almost extirpated from the ecosystem in the 60 to 80 years in the future. And Atlantic croaker distribution and abundance can expand much greater. And so again, it's that the differential species response to the same change. But thinking about major changes in fish populations going forward. And in a paper which I led in 2016, we tried to summarize all the information available across all of the managed species in the Northeast US, and then categorize species into having a negative response to climate change, having a neutral or indeterminate response to climate change, which is a brown bar in the middle, or having a positive response to climate change in this region, which is the green bar on the left. And what we can see is that there are a large number of species in the ecosystem which are anticipated to have a negative response, the red bar, but there are some species in this region which are anticipated to have a positive response. So again, it's kind of sort of, you start to think about this idea of winners and losers. In any given ecosystem, there will be species that benefit from climate change, and there will be species which are negatively impacted by climate change. So now I just want to quickly step into sort of the, how fisheries are changing in the region. And again, we can use these same 3 buckets. You can sort of just stay and deal with the change. You can move and try to track the change, or you can adapt and in response to the change. And in this case, adaptation is not sort of biological or evolutionary adaptation. It's more sort of adaptation strategies taken by humans to change behavior in response to climate change. And again, we'll just step through 3 examples from the Northeast US. In terms of staying, if you just try to stick it out, it can result in changing catch, changing cost, and changing markets. The example here, the bar diagram, is catch in the lobster fishery in Long Island Sound, which is close to home to Stony Brook. And you can see that, it built up in through the 1980s and then decreased dramatically in the 2000s. This decrease has been linked to warming temperatures. So the, lobster fisher has basically, fishing out of Long Island or Connecticut has had to, just deal with this decrease in lobster as a result, partially as a result of climate change. In terms of fisheries moving, the XY plot here on the left shows the center of distribution of summer flounder, similar to those center of distribution slides I showed earlier for black sea bass and scup. The center used to be, 38.5 degrees north, and it's now 40.25 degrees north. And then this dotted line here shows the center at which summer flounder are caught. And so summer flounder were caught around sort of the 38.5 degrees north, and are now being caught 39 to 39.5 degrees north. So the population is shifting northwards, and the catch in the fishery is shifting northwards. And then this figure on the right is from a paper by Brad Dubik, and Malin Pinsky was an author as well. And it shows the location where summer flounder were caught by boats from different states over time. So early in the time series, this orange, these boats in North Carolina were catching summer flounder here. They then track south somewhat and then rapidly move north to catch their summer flounder. So currently the boats from North Carolina are catching most of their summer flounder south of Long Island. You see a similar pattern for boats from Virginia here in sort of the purple, starting off of the Delmarva, tracking south, and then tracking north again up here off of Long Island. And that pattern continues. These are the boats from Maryland. These are the boats from New Jersey. And then once you get up into New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, there's been very little change in where those boats have been catching summer flounder. So you start to see a real dynamic of, boats from the south needing to make dramatic changes to their fishing locations, whereas boats from the north are not having to make those changes. So again, the fishing itself, the fishery itself is moving. In terms of the adaptation bucket, I think it's fair to say that businesses are always adapting to stay in business. they need to adapt because conditions are always changing. And so the ways in which fisheries are adapting is they're changing their gear, they're targeting different species, they're using new technologies. And the example here is sort of a contrast to the lobster fishery. So this inset plot is the lobster fishery that I showed previously. And this bar chart shows the Jonah crab fishery. And so when lobsters were being caught in abundance, a lot of Jonah crab were simply being discarded. As the lobster fishery and lobster catch started to decrease, these businesses started to develop a market for Jonah crab. And then by developing that market, the Jonah crab landings have increased dramatically. So the businesses have adapted from catching lobster to developing a market and now catching and landing Jonah crab. And so when we think again, sort of this broader coast-wide, system-wide, the community vulnerability, I had said at the beginning of my talk that there are 175 fishing communities on the coast from Maine to North Carolina. Each fishing community has a different set of species that it's catching. These species have a different value. And then these, from the plot that I showed earlier, looking at all those different species and which ones were going to be negatively affected and positively affected, we can begin to think about what is the vulnerability of a fishing community to changes, climate-driven changes in fish populations. And you can see, these communities in Maine, the vulnerability is moderate. There's communities here in southern New England where the vulnerability is high. There's some communities where the vulnerability is low. It's mixed, high again. And so you begin to see the complexity at which climate change forcing responses in fish, the changes in fish forcing responses in fishing, and then how those changes in fishing are affecting communities. And so in this question from a NOAA fisheries perspective, how can we help these communities adapt to climate change? How can we help to maintain sustainable fisheries, one of our core missions? So now I just want to talk about, how do we do this? What type of science is needed to help sustain and manage and protect resources in the face of climate change? And so we know the challenges that the conditions, the physical conditions, the biological conditions, the social conditions are changing fast. And so how do we ensure the sustainability of marine resources and coastal communities in this time of rapid change? And I like this idea of it's a wicked problem, not my idea by any stretch. It sort of came out of the public policy literature in the mid 1970s. These social scientists described wicked problems as difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, ill-defined, and changing requirements. And I think of it as a knot. You have a knot, you've got multiple ends, but you can't figure out which string to pull to loosen the knot because they're all connected. And there was a paper in Science in 2017 where they took this wicked problem concept and thought about ecosystems and how do we manage and interact with ecosystems. And they defined two traps. One trap is to just assume that there's one answer to the wicked problem and that you just need to work hard enough to find it, that one answer. It's the one solution to rule them all. And the other trap is to just sort of not act because of the overwhelming complexity of the problem. And that's sort of let's just keep doing what we're doing because the problem is so complicated, we're not going to be able to solve it anyways. Another sort of trap, which is implicit in the two traps that were defined, I just talked about, is this idea that science can be separated from solutions. And that these solutions can be developed independently by scientists and then provided back to managers. And so this really brings us into the fisheries management context. Is I think one of the traps of the wicked problem concept is that managers can define a problem give it to scientists. Scientists can develop the solution, the one solution that fits the problem, and then provide it back to managers. And so this wicked problem idea fits in very well with Eleanor Ostrom's conceptualization of complex socio-ecological systems and how do we manage in this complexity. And the Dr. Ostrom's sort of framework includes participatory management, where you work on defining and resolving problems together. It includes participatory science, where it's not simply professional scientists who work for NOAA Fisheries who are doing the science and providing it back, but it really is participatory across the stakeholders in the problem. And it's iterative and adaptive. It's not one-off solutions. It's continuing to work on a problem together. And so this is a slide about fisheries management and this idea of working together iteratively on the climate change and fisheries problem. And so from my perspective, I really think that we should work on using the systems that we have. There are a number of calls to, the systems that we have aren't going to work. Let's develop new systems. From my perspective, all the energy then goes into developing the system and not solving the problems. And whatever system that you have is never going to be perfectly suited for solving these complex problems. So the practical approach, I tend to be a practical person, is use the system that we have, but take this sort of wicked problem concept or complex socio-ecological concept and use those concepts in what we already have. And so in fisheries management, there are fisheries management councils, regional councils. In our regions, there's a New England Council and the Mid-Atlantic Council. Those councils are made up of stakeholders, commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, environmentalists, state managers. It's a group of stakeholders. And so working with those groups iteratively to address these problems, combining science and management, participatory management, participatory science. So in terms of climate change, how do we bring the climate change piece to this? In 2015, NOAA Fisheries, the group that I work for, developed a climate science strategy. And the strategy was meant, and this is from our previous administrator of NOAA Fisheries, Eileen Sobek. The strategy is part of a proactive approach to increase the production, delivery, and use of climate-related information to fulfill NOAA Fisheries mandates. We put it out in 2015, and we've been following that strategy for the past 6 years. And much of the work that I talked about in this presentation was a result of sort of the strategy we laid out in 2015. It really defined sort of this pyramid of building and maintaining adequate science infrastructure at the base, all the way up to robust management strategies and climate-informed reference points at the peak. And from using this strategy, we've been making progress in terms of these different pieces. So we have our monitoring programs, our long-term monitoring programs, our long-term science programs. In terms of tracking changes and providing early warnings, at the Science Center, we've developed state of the ecosystem reports, which we produce annually, that track different parts of the ecosystem and synthesize that to provide fisheries managers. In terms of understanding the mechanisms of change, we're involved in a number of laboratory studies. There's a number of laboratory studies going on at universities, Stony Brook being one, trying to get at a mechanistic understanding of the effect of temperature, ocean acidification, dissolved oxygen on species. In terms of projecting future conditions, I showed those high resolution projections that were conducted at Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, using those projections in fisheries applications. And I would say in the past 5 years, we've made significant progress on these bottom 4 parts of the pyramid. But stepping up into the top 3 is where the real crux of the matter is. It's, these adaptive management processes, these robust management strategies, and then this sort of climate ready fisheries, climate informed reference points. And so we're starting to lay the foundation for those 3 steps. We've been developing risk assessments with the fisheries management councils and in other sort of avenues in the protected species part of our portfolio. We've been developing scenario planning examples. We've recently completed scenario planning with Atlantic salmon and North Atlantic right whale, and are starting a fisheries scenario planning with our fisheries management partners in the region. And then up at the very top, we have management strategy evaluations and stock assessments. And that's really where we see that we need to sort of flesh out this pyramid. So how are we going to flesh out the pyramid? NOAA Fisheries has been working very closely with the NOAA research, which is the climate part of NOAA. And we've developed a climate and fisheries initiative, which we're putting through sort of the formal NOAA initiative approval process. And there are 4 main components to this climate and fisheries initiative. One is to enhance the utility of existing climate information. 2 is to advance NOAA's regional modeling system, particularly climate modeling at a regional scale. 3 is to establish regional teams and communities of practice. And this very much gets into that participatory science, participatory management approach, which I talked about in terms of wicked problems and complex socio-ecological systems. And then 4, to fuel innovation by linking the top 3 parts of this initiative to specific management applications in each region and specific targeted research. So in terms of thinking about climate and fisheries, obviously we do not have all the answers. Our fisheries management is not, taking into account climate change as well as we know it needs to, but we are building the framework and putting together the science that we need to get to the place where we really can say that we have climate ready fisheries management. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions, and hopefully there's enough time given the technological challenges that we had at the beginning. And just thank you for the time to talk with you. I appreciate the invite.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting and certainly covered a lot of topics that students and researchers here are interested in. And so do we have, I see Julie has a question.
Unmute yourself if you have a question.
If someone raised their hand and then they disappeared. I think it was Julie, but they kind of, anyhow, if you have a question, raise your hand. So
I had a question.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things, a lot of the pictures you showed was movement and of the fish north. And is that directly related to fish catch as well? Is the population directly related?
So that, again, it's a very good question. There is, one we can, through looking at long time series, we can show that many populations, their center and their edges have moved northwards and into deeper water. Getting into a mechanistic understanding of why that is a more challenging question. It takes process research. Certainly changing fishing patterns could affect the distribution. If you're fishing more heavily in one area than in another area, the distribution would change. And then the other idea is that, as the waters are warming, the thermal habitat of fishes is shifting. And because fish are cold-blooded, that they track their thermal habitat very closely. So I think both hypotheses are still valid and need more exploration. But if you look at the sort of looking at all the distributions that are changing, we see distributions of fish that are not caught in fisheries changing in the same direction and same magnitude as fish that are caught in fisheries. And so I would say that the inference I would take from that is that much of the change in distributions is caused by the environment. But it's certain that some of that change is caused by fishing activities. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. I had one corollary. Are they also moving deeper into colder water as well as north?
Yes, and so that the sort of the general pattern is that the fish on the mid-Atlantic shelf south of Long Island are moving northeastward, so northwards, and then there's also evidence that they're moving into deeper water. When you get up into the Gulf of Maine, the bathymetry is much more complicated. It's like an inverted mountain range, and in the Gulf of Maine, you don't see that northward shift as much, but you do see fish moving into deeper water, or in the mountain range analogy, moving up slope towards the peak of the mountain. So again, unfortunately, everything is complicated. There's species-specific responses, and there's these regional differences in the bathymetry. But much of the patterns that we are seeing are consistent with this idea of fish tracking their thermal habitat.
Thank you. Your talk was worth the wait.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning.
Just use the Mac.
Yeah, John, I'll follow up on that. I was thinking about, well, two things. I like that we're starting to see the papers coming out that are tracking the commercial fleet dynamics and where they're targeting fish, because one concern I've always had with looking at the distributional changes from the NIMP survey data is that I always wonder how much is spatial versus temporal. In other words, are the surveys just, because the temperature is changing, animals are moving earlier, and so we're picking them up in a different location. And so I like that we're seeing the commercial data in that summer flounder paper. I need to go back and read that, because one of the things I was thinking about with that paper is that I don't know if you're familiar, but summer flounder is a real hot issue here in New York because
you're suing us, remember?
Yeah. Well, not me personally, but the
and
state.
Not me personally, but yeah.
Yes, but because of the low quota, and that goes back to some historical cash payments that weren't recorded in tax documents from the fishery before the 90s. Anyhow, we don't need to go into that. But the point is that North Carolina is showing that big shift in their fleet, and I think traditionally they've landed the smaller summer flounder, because the larger summer flounder theoretically move further north in their annual movement. And so I was interested to see that North Carolina fishery, which has a very big quota, moving northward. But the Long Island and New York fisheries, which have a small quota, it looks like they're being able to land those catch right off of Long Island. And anyhow, I don't know that I have a question, but I hope we see more analyses, people looking at the behavior of the fishers, but they do need to take in some of that complexity of the motivations of the fleet in terms of how much quota they have and so forth.
Yeah, excellent point. Analyzing fisheries data there's a lot of complexity. Your point, Mike, which is very good, is so we've been doing a long-term survey since the 1960s. We typically sample the September to October period, and that's where some of those tracking, center of mass figures came from. But we also know that the seasonality of the system is changing. I didn't show that slide, but fall is happening later, and so you could argue that there is sort of a potential bias in our trawl survey, because it's effectively sampling a different part of the, sort of sampling more of a late summer as opposed to an early fall. This ecosystem has one of the largest seasonal temperature cycles in the world. So that
Yeah.
seasonality signal is important for us to work on teasing out. And then you're also, bringing in more of the commercial catch data. Both, I think Brad's paper was based on the vessel trip reports, but there's also observer data which is collected. And so we're starting to bring in more of that fishery dependent data into these studies.
Yeah, and as you said, it's complicated.
Yes.
So do we have any additional questions from audience members? Okay, someone has their hand up, but I don't see a name.
Yeah.
Okay, so the
of
unnamed
us.
person go first, and then we'll go to Joe.
The
Okay.
unnamed person was me, Glenn Lopez.
Hey, Glenn, how are you?
Good to see you, but Joe. Dad is it. Dad went first, so Joe, please go first.
Okay, I can go. Thanks, Glenn. John, this is a little bit of maybe a curveball question, but I'm just curious how NOAA is dealing with the impacts of COVID from a sampling monitoring effort. I know some of the labs had cruises that were canceled or delayed or minimized, as well as presumably the fishing pressure itself has some hiccup due to COVID. And I was just wondering how that's going to be handled, either in terms of data integration or modeling or whatnot.
Yeah, I would argue that that's a part of the wicked problem that's not in this Gordian knot. I mean, you need another little thread there for COVID. So last year, most of our field activity, survey activity didn't happen. We got sort of into the fall of last year, we did get some work done. This year, it's our intent to be fully successful. Our spring bottom trawl survey is out right now. Our coastal shark longline survey is out right now. Our ecosystem monitoring survey is scheduled to start in May. And our bottom longline survey in the Gulf of Maine is scheduled to start at the end of April. But then to your question, what do we do with all of the missing data from 2020? And that's, in part, it'll depend on how the data was used. And so some of our stock assessments are model based, and the models can just not use data that's not there. And so, the impact will be less. Some of our advice and assessments are very data driven. And so if we have a data driven assessment and there is no data, then there is no reason for us to do an assessment. And so, we're not going to be able to do, some of the assessments that we wanted to do in 2021 because we're not going to have the data from 2020. And it's unfortunate because, you will never be able to go back and collect that data. That'll be a hole in our time series and in many people's time series, forever. But we're going to, on the modeling based ones, we can just not include it, but on the database ones, we just can't collect the data. So there's no good answer. But yeah, we lost a lot of data. Most of our fishery surveys, we canceled our commercial fishery observers from March until August. And then when we started putting them back to sea in August, it was at a much lower rate than we typically do. So yes, there will be a lot of missing data.
Do you have, just follow up, do you have preliminary data that fishing catches were significantly reduced, most likely due to demand or not?
Again, it's like we were talking about with Mike, it's complicated. It depends on the species. For some species, there really wasn't a drop because of the demand stayed high. And then for other species, we did see this sort of decrease in catch because the market disappeared. The businesses adapted. I don't work at the regional office, but the other part of NOAA, which manages fisheries, they have what are called dealer permits. So if you want to sell fish, you need to have a permit. And so a lot of vessels applied for their own dealer permit to be able to do direct sales at the dock. So the businesses adapted to basically, find that market that they had lost through their restaurant sales. And so businesses are very good at figuring out ways to stay in business. So yeah, it's, there was a decrease, but I think it's back up to about where we have been in terms of catch levels, but it is also species dependent.
Yeah, and I think here the recreational sector went way up.
Yes.
I'm not positive on that, but I think sales of fishing equipment and stuff went up, and boat sales went up. But I'm not sure how that resulted in terms of catch. But I
Yeah,
think
and then the programs that monitor recreational catch were also not sampling for a period of time. So we're going to have a big unknown in 2020.
so. Glenn,
John, good to see you, and I really enjoyed your talk. I'd like to ask if you'd comment on what I think is another wicked problem, that is the interaction between right whale and lobster lines and lobster fishing, and how that might be affected by climate change, in particular in the Gulf of Maine.
Yeah, I mean, that is a wicked problem. So it's in another, it's in another part of the NOAA fisheries portfolio. We had sort of the protected species, whales. Many of you know, I'm sure, that North Atlantic right whale is critically endangered. Our population, we run a population model every year. This year, estimated that there were 366 individuals left, or 366, 368. There's an uncertainty in that of 5 individuals. And so, NOAA fisheries, we're challenged with how do we, what type of management is needed to keep this species from going extinct. And there's 2 main human caused mortality factors. One is ship strikes and the other is entanglement. And that's entanglement in lobster gear. The primary gear in the Northeast that has lines from the bottom to the surface, we call them vertical lines, is lobster gear. So it's largely a problem of entanglement in lobster gear. Just a piece of information: about 25% of the right whale population becomes entangled every year. And
Wow.
80 to 85% of the individuals in the population show evidence of being entangled in the past. And so how does that interact with climate change? I think climate change really sort of exacerbated this current crisis that we're in. The right whale population had been recovering until about 2010, and then stabilized and started declining again. And probably the prevailing hypothesis is that their main prey, the productivity of their main prey, decreased in the Gulf of Maine, Calanus finmarcticus, and it increased in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And that change has been linked to climate change. So then the right whales are traveling further. They calve off of Florida and Georgia, and they feed historically here in the Gulf of Maine, but now much more so in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So they're traveling further, going through more water, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they didn't have the same protections in place that we've been trying to limit the entanglement and ship strike risk in the U.S. for a number of years. So it created just a new threat to right whales. The Canadians have done a lot of work to improve their management measures, and now in the U.S. We are working through a process by which to implement more management measures, primarily with the fixed gear. So that would be lobster traps, Jonah crab traps, other types of fisheries which have a vertical line from the bottom to the surface. But I think it's it's human-induced mortality, and I think the problem has been exacerbated by climate change. And so the lesson that I would take from that is, many of our other problems have the potential to also be exacerbated by climate change.
Thanks, John.
Okay, it looks like Kim McCowan from DC has a question.
There's a question in the chat as well.
Hi, John. Nice
Hey, Kim, how are
presentation.
you?
Good, and you?
Good, thank you.
I wanted to follow up on your discussion of fisheries and their movements and quotas. And so here you show that the North Carolina and many of the southern fisheries are moving north. Mike had mentioned that quotas are established on historic data. So now that species are moving, is there any discussion of re-estimating quota distributions?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion. One of the benefits of my job is I also get to attend all the Fishery Management Council meetings. So there are 5 or 6 New England Fishery Management Council meetings a year, and I think 6 Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council meetings a year. So I get to listen to all of those conversations. The one important thing to remember is that from 3 miles out is federal waters. And vessels have federal fishing permits. So anyone can fish off of New York, anyone can fish off of North Carolina if they're outside of 3 miles and have a federal fishing permit. Then where the quotas come in is for a number of species, each state has a quota for how much can be landed in that state. And that's where this, some of the disconnect happens is, the vessels in North Carolina, federal fishing permit, are then going back and landing in North Carolina, but they're traveling further. Vessels in New York are fishing with a federal fishing permit and then landing in New York. They're not traveling as far, but as you indicated, they have lower quota. So it's a combination of, it's a federal resource, a national resource, which anyone in the nation has the right to get a permit and use. And then the state, once you catch something in federal waters, you have to land it. And so you have to come back to some state. And so how does the federal quotas match this landing in states? And so there's been a lot of conversation at the Mid-Atlantic Council, particularly over over the state assignment of quota with regards primarily to black sea bass and summer flounder. There's been several approaches that have been proposed. And it's just, it's a long, slow conversation, because in the end, if you're going to change, your quota allocation, somebody's going to get more and somebody's going to get less. They did recently go through something with black sea bass where they made some small changes to quota allocation. And I think, from my recollection from that meeting is that no one was satisfied, which was also interpreted as it was probably the best decision to come up with. But yeah, it's quota allocation is probably the hardest problem in fisheries. It's who has the rights to watch which fish, which is sort of a public resource, and it's assigning those rights, which is where most of the contention in fisheries management is, I believe.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. I think you're on mute, Mike.
Sorry. So we had a question in the chat that whether or not there's any subsidies to fisheries that are having to go further to catch the fish that are shifting distributions.
Not that I'm aware of. In general, I think there's some things in the U.S. fisheries management process that you could call subsidies, but I think it would be a stretch. And so I'm not aware of any subsidies for vessels that need to travel further. I mean, Mike, you've been involved in sort of the fisheries realm for a while as well. Are you aware of anything that you would call a subsidy for this?
No, I don't think so. But it's an interesting point, and it actually gets back to the allocation issue. And unfortunately, there's winners and losers if you change the allocations, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to come all the way up the East Coast to catch fish when local fleets can catch them, but anyhow, you're well aware of that issue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think this gets back to the wicked problem is it, from one perspective, it makes perfect sense. And from another perspective, it doesn't make sense. If you're in New York, it doesn't make sense. If you're in North Carolina, it makes sense. And that's where that's where you really need to think about doing things from my perspective in a in a participatory consensus building environment, not in a, someone steps in and sort of comes up with a solution without participation by those that are going to be affected by the solution. So it comes down to perspective.
Yeah, let's see. Do we have any other questions from the audience? So I don't see any. I have one thing that I'm just interested in. I don't know. Have you looked into the winter skate situations, St. Lawrence? The reason I ask is that I hadn't seen the genomics papers or epigenetics papers on that. And so I'm going to go and look at them now that you raised them in the talk. But that population is interesting because I don't think it's migratory.
Right.
And all the rest of winter skate, are going down off Cape Hatteras and turning around and coming all the way back up to George's Bank and so forth. And so it really gets to your point of either stay in place, adapt, or move. And I wonder if the migratory segment of winter skate, which is the vast majority of them, have an advantage in a sense, because they can move to select optimal conditions. But anyhow, it's interesting. I need to follow up on that.
Yeah, and again, that's the sort of the adaptation piece is very much out of my expertise. But to your point of yeah, they are benefiting because they're moving, but that's also got energetic costs.
Yeah.
And so in the evolutionary or ecological framework, it's interesting to think about these trade-offs. If you can stay in place, then you don't need to spend the energy to move. But what are you giving up by not moving? And yeah, so it's the trade-offs. But that example for me is just a very interesting one as well, because there just isn't that much work done. And and coming back to we've been doing projections, and a lot of people do projections, and you assume that the biology of an animal is going to be the same 80 years from now as it is now. But in essence, the implicit assumption is that the animals are not adapting. They're not undergoing, genetic adaptation or epigenetic adaptation. And I think a study like the winter skate one, basically says that assumption is probably not right, and we need to be looking at it a lot more.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to have to look into that St. Lawrence population in a little more detail. Okay, so I think that's all the questions we have. And John, really wonderful talk, and thank you for sticking around and answering all these questions. Just wonderful to have you here presenting. Really appreciate it. And I see Josie just came back on.
No, I've been here. I just didn't have
Your video.
yes.
Yeah.
I've been here. Yeah, that was really interesting. I'm glad we figured out a solution.
Yeah, well, thank you for sticking in there with me. I was almost ready to give up getting, at one point, but thank you for the encouragement to keep trying.
Yeah. I don't know what was going on with that. It was a little strange.
Well, I'm guessing it's probably the microphone on
Yeah.
on the computer that I was using,
Yeah.
which I will need to remember.
Okay. Well, everyone, thank you for coming. And again, John, have a great rest of your Friday and weekend. And again, thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.